Hello, this is Ginna Macdonald. I'm on the board of directors of the Rye Historical Society here in New Hampshire, and we've been enjoying ourselves reading from some history books that we have on our shelves every Sunday at happy hour, which starts at 5, so cheers. And right now we are reading Rye on the Rocks, The Tale of a Town That Resorted to Resorting by William Varrell. This was self-published back in 1962, and it is out of print, but it is available at the Rye Public Library. So anyway, let's go on. We are reading about boardwalks and buggies. It sounds like fun. I think I need another sip. Boardwalks and buggies. Although the Civil War created a definite tourist's vacuum at the resorts of the New England coast, the ashes of the Ocean House were barely cold, and the ashes of Atlanta were yet firm pine when the foundations of the golden age of Rye Beach hoteldom were laid. Evidently, Job Jennis had few plans of retiring from the resort field, for the winter of 1862 to 63 saw rise over the ruins of the first Ocean House, a new model in grandeur second to none on the East Coast. This new 250-foot-long hotel, surrounded by continuous porches and topped by turrets of many different sizes and dimensions, was certainly a marvel for the small farming community of Rye. Not to be outdone, only 3 years later, John Colby Philbrick had a new 3 1/2 story addition built alongside his Atlantic house and Abbott Cottage. Enclosed by a 2-story piazza, this new Philbrick's hotel was opened to the resorting public in August of 1865. Some say that Admiral Farragut, the naval hero of New Orleans and Mobile Bay, was a resident at the Atlantic at the time, and therefore in attendance. However, the time spent by Farragut at Rye Beach is not clear. Although local sources say that the Admiral and his family spent the summer of 1865 at Rye Beach, others say that in 1865 he traveled on his flagship, Hartford, to the nearby Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, where he was the summer guest of his friend, the Commandant. What is no doubt true is that he was entertained and hosted his own parties at the Atlantic and New Philbrick's, which were so widely known for their fine foods and genial host. However, while it is not certain whether or not Farragut was ever a summer resident of Rye Beach, it is known that in 1866, Philbrick's advertised under the new name of the Farragut. However successful this new hotel, John Colby Philbrick did not live to expand the possibilities of his new enterprise. An extremely wealthy man, he died January 15, 1867, at the age of 51. His success can be attested to the fact that at the beginning of his career as a landlord, he was taking boarders at $2.50 per week, and at the time of his death, he was receiving the unheard of price of $5 per day at the new Farragut. So there's a picture here of the first Farragut, which it says burned in 1882. So that's that. Evidently, the death of one of the giants of the local industry did nothing to slow a building boom of unprecedented scope and possibilities, for Philbrick had not been the only original pioneer to enter the field of hotel construction at the close of the Civil War. At Sandy Beach, Daniel Foss had returned with plans for a more pretentious Prospect House than that destroyed by fire 3 years earlier. Indeed, the new hotel was soon a reality, but only 1 week after the new building had been occupied by Mr. Foss and his family, While Mr. Foss was away in the country seeking the frame for a yet-to-be-constructed stable, the second Prospect House burned to the ground. As the new building was empty at the time of its destruction, once more a Foss fire was suspected as incendiarism. But if someone were deliberately causing Mr. Foss's dreams to go up in smoke, he was not discovered. Continuing the construction of Rye Beach buildings classified as hotels were the Seaside House and the Surf House, built just across the street from the Ocean House. Although not as imposing as their grand neighbor, these two later hotels were very important as accommodations for the many servants who were at Rye Beach with their employers who were summering at the Ocean House. Gonna take a sip. However impressive the Venice Beach hotels, also extending a strong arm to the elite of the day was the Sagamore House at Frost's Point. It was in 1867 that the original property of Captains Clark and Toll were purchased by Messrs. George and James Pierce. These brothers were no newcomers to the hotel trade, having gained much experience operating the Rockingham for Frank Jones in Portsmouth. It was a very short while before the Pierces had tripled the size of their former inn by constructing a 3-story wing studded with bay windows and crowned with an 8-sided cupola. The reporter for the Portsmouth Chronicle was so impressed by the remodeling that he reported that the great quantities of silks and plate mirrors transformed the country inn into a miniature French palace. A sixth addition to the hotel colony at Rye was the Seaview House, constructed in 1868 by George Luget, a former clerk at the Atlantic. The reason for its location well inland from the shore is not known, for the sea view was only from rear windows and a 4th-floor cupola. But architecturally, it was a wonder, with its 2nd-story piazza and its ballroom mounted on rubber blocks. To just who belongs the credit for this feat of imaginative engineering is not known, but it was reported that dancing at the Seaview was no different than at one of its neighbors mounted on foundations of granite. In fact, construction-wise, the Seaview was less fortunate than its contemporaries, for although the shock of a milling crowd might have been lessened under the dance floor, the rubber block construction did not extend under the front piazza. It was a somewhat surprised gathering who, one night, while waiting for the ballroom doors to open, caused that porch to collapse and were sent sprawling to the ground about 6 feet below, at the expense of several bruised bones and prides, and at least one insurance suit fracture. However, this event is probably an exception to the Seaview. The clientele of the establishment is well illustrated by the Hobsons of Haverhill, who not only came to the Seaview each season, but came with, among other things, 5 carriages and 4 magnificent carriage horses. The 9 blacksmiths of 1879 seem like a great many for a town of only 1,000, but when one stops to consider the number of horses needed for the 4 to 5 mile trip to the railroad stations and back, with the hundreds of guests and the tons of steamer trunk luggage, the labor force seems seriously insufficient to its labors. It was news for the Boston papers when, during a 22-day period in August of 1872, the Ocean House grossed $22,000. Taking into consideration that it was the day of 7-course dinners, one is led to wonder if they ever got time to change the tablecloths at the Ocean House with its dining room seating capacity of 400. Not only were there the many guests to care for, but the days of Rye's golden era were also the days of many servants. Even the boarding house patrons came with maids for the children and the family coachman. Many of these servants stayed at the smaller boarding houses or boarded in private homes. But everyone still had to be fed, and come what may, chickens only lay 1 egg a day. Every home had its contribution to the era, whether it be a dishwasher to the Farragut or a bushel of pears to the Appledore. It was Rye's chief source of hard cash, and everyone made money while the sun shone. There's a picture here of the Seaview House, which is the site of the present Rye Beach Post Office. So that's beautiful. The history of a beach resort would naturally be incomplete unless some emphasis were put on the beach itself. As far back as 1823, it was recorded in the New Hampshire Gazette that people enjoyed resorting to Rye's sandy beaches, namely Wallace Sands, Foss's Beach, and Gennis Beach, for reasons of health and the magnificent ocean view. As was the case with many geographical points at that time, the beaches took the name of the family owning the bordering property. The fact that people came to the beaches does not necessarily mean that they went in the water. Most likely, the majority only drove or walked on the sand, with some of the more advanced individuals removing their shoes and stockings. A story is told that surf bathing did not become popular until after the hotels had become more or less well established. Even then, it was believed to be unhealthy unless a person first wet his head. The story goes on to say that Mr. John C. Philbrick of the Atlantic and Farragut houses used to have to take 2 hours each afternoon to go to the beach with his guests. Once at the beach, he would carry each guest individually into the water and lower the guest's head into the surf, after which it was thought perfectly safe for the guest to be dropped into the water without ill effects. The fact that swimming had become quite popular by the 1860s is evident by the size of the beach houses shown in the background of a lithograph made of the Ocean House at that time. Certainly after a very few years, all the hotels and many boarding houses had private buildings at the shore in which their guests might change into their beach clothes. It should be remembered that at this time, the only exposed skin shown by either sex was the hands and the face. It took the beaches to expose the forearm. However, a reliable source relates that a Canadian staying with Mr. John H. Foss at the Pleasant View broke tradition by dressing in his bathing attire in his room and walking thus clad to the beach, only to completely disrobe when he arrived at that part of Foss's Beach, which he thought to be deserted. Since many of the hotels at the extreme south of Rye were not located on a sandy beach, a number of them had their beach houses in one general area where the beach club is now located. These hotels did not own the land on which their beach houses were located and maintained only squatters' privileges. Hi, everyone. These beach houses were destroyed on the 4th of July, 1882. They were rather poorly constructed buildings, having open ceiling in order to afford some ventilation. Since they were all open, it became favorite pastime for small boys to throw firecrackers over the top, needless to say, much to the danger and annoyance of the occupants. Quite simply, one of these firecrackers failed to explode and lay smoldering until that time, as it caused the dry old building to burst into flame. At the time, most people were at dinner, and once the fire got started, there was no putting it out, as flaming shingles soon blew to other bathhouses, igniting them also. Only Sawyer's bathhouse was saved by cutting away its pilings on one side and letting it drop into a small brook. It was quite ironic that Sawyer's was the only bathhouse saved, for the incident is still recalled, with some sources claiming that the Sawyer boys supplied the firecrackers. After this fire, it was decided by the Locks, who owned the land on which the houses had been located, that they would construct and operate public bathhouses to be used by guests of the hotels whose buildings had been burned. These new houses were evidently quite successful, for several additions were found built, being climaxed by a stone pavilion built in 1899. The foundations of this building were built very deep, a fact which led some people to believe that the building was to be of an underground nature. However, Mr. Locke had lived at the beach all his life and knew the great strength of the tidal forces. This business operated by the Lockes offered much prestige to Rye Beach, since it included the only hot saltwater baths north of Newport, Rhode Island. When you stop to think of it, the idea of public baths reminds one more of ancient Rome than the New England coast. But during the days before the American plan, room with private bath, this was a very important business. On a typical Saturday, as many as 95 people might bathe in heated seawater in one of 12 porcelain tubs and receive a message from one of 9 colored, a massage from one of 9 colored masseuses. These baths could be had for 50 cents or 6 for $2.50. Locker rental at the turn of the century was 15 cents or 2 for 25 cents. However, this is not the only mention of early bathing at Rye. Eben Seavey had constructed over the brook, which ran beside his boarding house, a bathhouse which can today be most nearly associated with a shower curtain. The Lockes also used a steam whistle to announce the temperature of the seawater. Each morning at 10:30, Mr. Locke would don a pair of rubber boots and wade out into the surf with a thermometer. At 10:45, followed by one long blast for attention, the sea temperature would be announced by steam blasts throughout Rye Beach. According to records kept at the Drake House in 1884, warm water was 65 to 66, and cold water was down around 54. A travel folder published at the time said that after the initial shock, the water at Rye Beach was quite enjoyable. There's a picture here of some people in the water at Rye Beach. Wearing so many clothes. The Lockes also maintained a diving float, and boatmen were always in attendance during the regular bathing hours. The people at Rye Beach seem quite proud of the fact that they have never had a drowning as a result of surf bathing at their end of Genesee Beach. However, in 1881, Charles Woodbury, an employee at the Seaview House, was drowned. Late in the afternoon, he was seen by some children to run from the Seaview House into the surf. Although no one witnessed the actual drowning, his body was washed ashore on the incoming tide. At an inquest conducted by the selectmen of the town, it was decided that suicide caused death by drowning and insanity. The summer seasons have, however, been marred by drownings at the other beaches and at Rye Harbor. Surf bathing at Rye in the 19th century has been summed up quite well in an advertising bulletin published in the 1870s. Here each day during the season, the fashion and wealth of great cities can be seen in the water. Merchants, matrons, heiresses, professional men, and children, all clad in outer garbs, which fashion sanctions as bathing dress, but which give such a comical appearance to everybody, all splashing and dripping like tritons and mermaids. True, the majority of Rye's patronage came from within a 70-mile radius, but in the 70s it was not surprising to see such people as Robert Lincoln or the Secretary of the Navy entering a Rye coach at the railroad station. And in 1870, Cornelius Vanderbilt himself spent the entire summer at the Sagamore House. Taking into consideration that these men, plus at least 2 presidents, found their way to Rye Beach, it cannot be denied that the resort had a national reputation. Although meaningless to the untrained eye, old registers hold many entries of the formerly prominent, and alongside these meaningless names are the very meaningful cities of New York, Baltimore, St. Louis, London, Paris, and Melbourne, Australia, each holding a story of its own. Completing the full cycle of summer activities were the oyster and ice cream saloons, casinos, halls, and churches. Built especially for the summer trade were Union Chapel at Little Boar's Head and St. Andrew's near the Farragut, The site of St. Andrews was especially given by Mrs. John Colby Philbrick as a final resting place for her husband. However small these churches, they served as pulpits for some of the more famous preachers of the country. Many was the society dame who engineered the services of her prominent Boston or New York minister. Among those who preached at Rye Beach's society gatherings, were Edward Everett Hale and the Reverend James de Normandy. To further illustrate the extent of Rye's great hotel building boom of the late 1860s and early 70s were the enormous boarding houses such as Sawyer's and the Marden House on Sea Road and the cottages of Straw's Point, a number of which advertised as having accommodations for 100 guests. At Sandy Beach, a third Prospect House was soon gazing out to sea, and a few years later an exact replica was built by Sylvanus Foss, followed by the Pleasant View, built by his cousin John Hunt. And then here on the opposite page is a advertisement in Mr. Weld's Hall, Rye Beach, evening, grand operatic concert by following the celebrated artists of the New York Academy of Music. So you've got admission was 50 cents. With such an impressive physical plant, the town of Rye should have gone on to be an unchallenged lion of the resorting world, but a national depression followed by a series of fires which seemed to singe or char everyone, left Rye with wounds never to be fully healed. There were still a number of fine hotels to be built, but never was a resort born with such promise, only to have its potential so rapidly cremated and buried with such display. Cheers. Time for a sip. It was only 3 years after this, its glowing praise by the press, that the Sagamore House was the first of the golden era to go down by the torch of destruction. On June 12, 1871, there were many people working around this large hotel preparing it for its seasonal grand opening. Just who was responsible is not known, but what is important is that shortly after lighting the cook stove for the first time of the season, the woodwork around the chimney was noticed to be on fire. Those nearby immediately set to work to extinguish the blaze and appeared to be successful. But fearing that the blaze had worked itself into the partitions, a man was sent riding for the fire department in Portsmouth. It was about 10:30 that a Mr. Bartlett, in a near state of hysteria, was seen running through Market Square declaring that the Sagamore House was on fire. Upon receiving the alarm, the fire horses were immediately hitched to the apparatus and the journey to Rye begun. However, because some of the more prominent citizens of Portsmouth did not want to leave that city's buildings unprotected for the sake of a hotel in Rye, and because some of the residents of the higher buildings reported that the hotel had already burned to the ground, the equipment was turned back. However, a short while later, a second alarm was sounded, and this time the firemen did not turn back, arriving at the hotel about an hour and a half after the fire had first been discovered. At this point, the blaze was still not out of control, and after laying hose to a nearby creek, the men had the blaze all but confined. However, at the most crucial moment, a length of hose burst. As luck would have it, there was no more hose available, and as the tide was going out, it was soon next to impossible to get water on the flames. When it still appeared that the new wing might be saved, some axe-happy firemen broke a window in the cupola, thus causing this former observation point to act as a giant chimney and sealing the doom of the Pride of the Brothers Pierce. Soon the entire building was a roaring inferno, and although much of the lavish furniture had been saved, the unforeseen failure put the firemen in such a state of frustration and despair that they are said to have demolished with axes everything not already consumed by the flames. All in all, it was a garish end to a hotel which had brought so much prominence to the rocky shores of Rye. Being deeply in debt as a result of the recent expansions and only partially insured, The Pierces were unable to rebuild and were forced to spend the remainder of their days on the Rye shore, living in the bowling alley, the only building of their resort not destroyed by the grand opening of 1871. Perhaps the Pierces were good hotelmen, but their banking habits left much to be desired. The loss was compounded by the fact that their entire savings of $700 stored in a trunk were lost when the eight-sided cupola fell into what could have been the master suite of the Sagamore House. It was only 1 year and a season later that the seaside and surf houses were destroyed by fire. Although little is known of the seaside house, the surf house is known to have been a large 4-story building with adjoining livery stable. Of all the Rye Beach hotel fires suspected as arson, the surf house seems to be high on the list of prime suspects. It was in October 1872. Let me show you a picture of the Sagamore House in 1871 at Odiorn's Point. So that's that. So it was in October 1872 that after an unsuccessful season under its nearly 10th proprietor, that the surf house was discovered to be on fire. Although all animals and carriages were reported saved from the livery stable, the hotel was a complete loss. Those present are said to have been so excited that after saving all mattresses via the upper story windows, they attempted to salvage the chamber crockery in like manner, only to have nothing to show for their efforts but a great heap of broken china. There's another picture here of the second Ocean House, which is right there. However damaging might have been the first 3 Golden Era hotel casualties, it was but a few months after the loss of the surf house that Rye Beach hoteldom suffered its most crippling blow. It took but a short while on the morning of April 4th, 1873, for word to spread through Rye that fire had broken out around the cookhouse chimney at the Ocean House. Many volunteers are reported to have turned out to the oral alarm, but by the time they reached the beach, the entire hotel roof was on fire, and there was little they could do but attempt to salvage some of the hotel furnishings. It had been a late spring, and all the hotel's cisterns were still frozen solid. Although a beach hotel, the ocean was too far away for a bucket brigade in the town with a $100,000 hotel, but no firefighting equipment. An attempt was made to fight the blaze from the hotel cupola, but a brisk northwest wind soon took the flames to that point of attack, and it was but a short while before flames were shooting from every window of the 400-room monster. The cupola fell early in the blaze, reportedly sending a Niagara of cinders and flame down the 5 flights of the central stairway, and followed by the collapse of the 2 great wings. It was less than an hour before the pride of the Genesis of Genis Beach was but a pile of ashes. It is said to have been the thing to do in the days immediately preceding the fire, to go digging in the ashes for souvenir silver spoons of the once mighty Ocean House. Time to take a sip if you're joining me. Since Mr. Genis had planned a broad, tree-lined avenue flanked with private cottages to be built from the wealth of Massachusetts mills, it was thought by all that old Job would rebuild. However, Mr. Genis was a sick man who had lost his only son the previous year. So after inserting a public notice of thanks to all who had attempted to save his property, he retired from the hotel business, none too poor with the insurance from his fame-making enterprise. Thus, after only a few short years of brilliance, the golden age of Rye Beach had come of age and passed away. In 1872, Rye had been of such importance to the resorting world that Frank Leslie had sent an artist to town to make sketches for his National Illustrated newspaper. But following the loss of the Ocean House, the resort was no longer newsworthy, and the sketches were not printed. True, there were still many years of brilliant summers for Rye Beach, but the resort never fully recovered from the loss of national prominence which the Ocean House and its neighbors afforded. A first-class resort needed a number of great hotels to offer their ballrooms, and restaurants and social life to the general outlook, and with the loss of the ocean house went this high variety of style. The country was interested in Saratoga, a resort which was building, not Rye Beach, which was burning, and out of season, too. The Farragut continued to offer first-class services, and the Seaview was anything but a second-rate hotel. But the boarding houses continued to be just that, and Rye passed from a first-class resort to a coastal town with a few first-class hotels and lots of scattered bedrooms. Indeed, it was noticed by the mid-1870s that a great deal was lacking at Rye Beach. Residents themselves blamed it on the few town fathers who controlled all the good land and would not sell for fear that they might be able to pluck the next prospective buyer a bit more naked. Rye was also at a decided disadvantage in that although it has over 6 miles of coastline, very little land next to the ocean is high ground. Also agreed upon was the fact that Rye had erected few, if any, streetlights, and it was generally quite an accomplishment to find some of our seaside cottages at night without getting lost in deep woods or finding oneself halfway to the shoals. One Boston correspondent went so far as to infer that some of the Rye boarding houses were known to serve boiled crow as a regular entree. Although at the scene of the crops, it is evident from many old menus that many hotels advertised a gourmet's delight to have only 50% of the listed items. The following menu is copied from an 1887 newspaper, and although perhaps a bit inflated, is no doubt very near true. Breakfast at the average boarding house consisted of tea, coffee, broma, fried potatoes, baked potatoes, broiled mackerel, broiled sirloin steak, hot rolls, graham rolls, cold bread, scrambled eggs, and hot berry muffins. Lunch included tomato soup, boiled cod with egg sauce, roast chicken, roast sirloin of beef, mashed potatoes, sliced tomatoes, green corn, beets, green cucumbers, pickles, apple pie, squash pie, ice cream, sponge cake, and fruit. The day was completed with a supper meal of escalloped oysters, cold roast beef, white bread, graham bread, baker's breads in variety, fruit cake, marble cake, berries, and fruit. Is it any wonder that it was the day of frock coats and hoop skirts? Going price for the day was $7 per week with meals. Typical of the conflict between town and resort was a request of Frank Philbrick of the Farragut. Realizing that the resort was in need of many public improvements, it was in 1874 that he petitioned the town of Rye to widen the street in front of the Farragut in order that there might be room to construct a boardwalk. However, the reaction of the voters was typical, completely unwarranted and uncalled for. Rye was too interested in raising chickens to notice the goose that laid the golden egg. The Rye column of an 1878 newspaper states that it is rumored that certain parties of this town have contracted with an agent in San Francisco to import a herd of Chinese into town in early spring to be employed in the hotels, boarding houses, and as farm laborers. It concluded by saying that threats are being made to give them a hot reception upon their arrival. At least there is some indication that some wanted to maintain their labor monopoly. But there are also indications that all summer help was not local. One diary states that the new girl hired from Berlin, New Hampshire to wash dishes at $4 per week was not successful and had to be let go. However, 3 days later, it goes on to state that a new kitchen girl was hired at $3.50. There's a picture here of, says Henry Knox and Ocean Wave Help. And says, note each person holding a symbol of his or her position. So that's right there. Perhaps Rye's chief problem was that its hotel builders had little income other than what came in over the front desk. Saratoga was built on money from the merchants of Broadway, and Long Beach was the result of Philadelphia. Mainline money. But Rye Beach was the creation of farmers, carpenters, and former desk clerks. An example of big resort money, even closer to home, was the Wentworth in Newcastle. Although built in 1874, this resort hotel was not outstanding until the 1880s, when the money of Frank Jones transformed it with towers, elevators, and solid walnut bedsteads. However wounded, Rye Beach did not lay down to die, but continued catering to the resorting public, with perhaps the biggest change being that after 1873, Rye Beach was not 6 miles of seacoast, but a small select area at the town's southern end bounded by the Drake House, the Farragut, the Seaview, and the sea. Although never to be repeated on the scale of the days immediately preceding the Civil War, whereas the early 1870s had seen 6 hotels burn in half as many years, the later years of the decade saw less flame and more often the sound of building. The greatest construction occurred at Sandy Beach, where, taking advantage of high oceanside property, of which the resort was in such short supply, and what was quickly recognized as one of the most beautiful views on the New Hampshire coast, Henry Knox constructed the Ocean Wave House. So here that is. It's a picture. This original building was not especially beautiful, looking as if its builders had started with a central cupola and boarded up the ends when they ran out of money, but it was the first hotel to be built in Rye in 10 years. To its last days, the hotels being built by country craftsmen was evidenced by the fact that a glance down any of its corridors revealed that the molding over no 2 doors was exactly parallel, but its view couldn't be beat, and although with as much as a 10% error, it advertised that every room looked out to sea. Probably one of the biggest complaints of the Ocean Wave was an unreliable water system. The well always seemed to be full in April and October, but come the 4th of July with a house full of guests, and it had an annual habit of going dry. Only 3 years after its construction, a giant windmill was added to the hotel's profile, but the biggest windmill in Rye couldn't pump water out of a dry well. No doubt the Ocean Wave was very good for Sandy Beach, for it prompted the building of a nearby livery stable, a casino, and the nearby Prospect House prospered to the point of adding a 26-room wing, each room with a different letter of the alphabet. But however classy in the eyes of the local farmers, it was not the golden age. At the same time, the Wentworth was buying solid walnut bedroom sets. The Ocean Wave was buying pine and doing the painting at the hotel. Indeed, some of this original pine furniture was still in use in the hotel during its last days, and although functional, it still had the original hand paint job, and it looked it. There was also limited building at the southern end of the Rye Beaches during these same years, probably the greatest addition being the magnificent new hall and farmers club built at the Farragut. Although composed of a number of separate buildings being connected by a covered promenade, the Farragut offered what seemed like miles of promenading without ever leaving the building. So here's a picture of the Prospect House. The construction also included an addition to the Drake House, which doubled its size, and a new boarding house of L. Thomas Sanborn, notable in that it was leased to Robert Lincoln, the president's son, before the new varnish was even dry. However, the Rye fires did not discriminate against the well-known, and only 3 years after its construction, during the extremely dry summer of 1882, Sanborns burned to the ground, the embers of which are said to have set a fire which destroyed the boarding house of Abraham Perkins and set grass fires in all directions, which for a while threatened the entire community. However threatening the fire at Sanborns, it was the fire of the previous April that had appeared to be the death blow of Rye Beach. It was on April 18, 1882, that the Farragut was reduced to ashes on the rocks of Rye. No one was sure just how the fire got started, but by the time it was discovered, the issuing room was a mass of flames, which signaled the success of another fire out of control. It was all that those nearby could do to save the hotel records and a small amount of furniture before the flames raced through the promenade like children on the way to the beach, reducing the new hall. Farmers' Club and the promenade itself to memories by a great shower of flame and cinders which accompanied the fall of the great hotel with its brass beds, chamber crockery, and brilliant history. For a time it had appeared that the Abbott cottage might be saved. But there being no effective way of getting water on a burning 4-story hotel, this building in the nearby shadows was soon just another stick in the celebrated furnace. It was, however, the action of cutting away the connecting promenade which saved the Atlantic House and stables for later generations. It was reported the following day that the Rye roads were filled with the curious from miles around, traveling to view the ruins of the once mighty Farragut. However curious, it was the loss of the Farragut that finally brought the town to understand just how much it depended upon the resort trade for its livelihood. As it was feared by many that this latest casualty would follow its predecessors and fail to rebuild, a petition was quickly circulated that, to ensure the rebuilding of the Farragut, that hotels should be tax-free for a number of years. However, Frank Philbrick and his mother had run the Farragut well and had no plans of leaving their place of high esteem on the rocks of Rye, where their ancestors had not been driven off by the burning of their wheat crop. The Boston architectural firm of S.S. Thayer was immediately engaged to design a new Farragut, more grand than anything previously seen at Rye Beach. So there's another picture over here. This is a picture of the Atlantic House. It's really kind of hard to see, but it's from 1879. By August 15th, the new foundations had been completed. Before the leaves were off the trees that fall, the new hotel was completely boarded in, and after a winter, sorry, it's my dog, and after a winter of interior craftsmanship, the finest hotel yet to be built on the Rye shores was opened to the resorting public. Although farming was not included on the social calendars of the Rye's Victorian hotels, many of the younger vacationers were sowing their crop, being wild oats. Secret nocturnal visits, as a result of father's opposition to the beau, are not a product of the present generation. Newspapers tell of one such affair when a boarder from Sandy Beach became infatuated with one of the socially prominent daughters of Straws Point. Evidently, their secret visits were quite successful until one such meeting was interrupted by the call of fire. After seeing his hostess to safety, the gentleman is said to have gallantly sought his escape via his way of entry, a second-story window. However, in the dark and smoke, he became lost in the maze of outbuilding and was trapped in a dead-end escape route. For the following morning, his charred remains were found beneath the burned-out window, leaving mute evidence to their secret trysts. Oh, that's so sad. So here's a working view of the ocean wave on one side. And then on the other side, there is the Atlantic House, the Farragut. So that's right there. There is also evidence that Rye's resorting era had, what in time of war would be known as camp followers. Reportedly, a number of the more adventuresome swains at the Farragut are said to have become involved to the extent of requiring medical attention. However, not wanting to expose their position, they are said to have requested the advice of the hotel blacksmith, who, seeing his chance to get even with some of the young dandies, is said to have prescribed a horse liniment that all but ruined a few of the eligible young bachelors of Rye Beach. Of course, this was probably an isolated incident, but even as late as 1910, when a young couple resorting at Sandy Beach missed the last electric car from Hampton Beach and were forced to walk back, the concern was not that they had to walk, but that the sun was coming up just as they completed their journey. Thus did the local world pass during the days of Harrison and Cleveland. The boarding houses had the bedrooms, but it was the Farragut that was Rye Beach. The season opened at Farragut Grand Ball On the 4th of July, the fireworks at the Farragut were the ones to see, and even such items as the Farragut buying a new Abbott and Downing coach were always big news. However, the Rye resort world of the 80s had a few more hotels to succumb to the fire epidemic before settling down to the turn of the new century. On Thursday, the 26th of June, 1890, it could be reported for a third time in 40 years that a great fire had destroyed the Prospect House at Foss's Beach. Since the barn was not destroyed, it is certain this hotel occupied a site now known as Windy Hill. The night before had seen one of the most violent thunderstorms to hit the area in many years, with much damage being reported between Hampton Beach, New Hampshire, and York Beach, Maine. Situated on a hill as it was, the Prospect House was highly vulnerable to being struck by lightning, having been struck twice before, the most recent being the previous summer, when the flagpole was completely shattered by a thunderbolt. Oh, wow. Thank you all for joining me. I've got 7 people now. Woohoo! The entire family and a few neighbors were in the front room when a clap of thunder was heard to explode directly overhead. One of the neighbors was later to spread the rumor that a bomb had been exploded in the chimney, but the facts seemed to indicate that the kitchen chimney had been toppled by a bolt of lightning. For investigation showed that the chimney was down and the kitchen ceiling a sheet of flame. Help was immediately summoned from the nearby neighbors as the drenched Edward Downs ran madly about Sandy Beach, spreading the alarm. But in the violence of the storm, the Prospect House was soon well on its way to join its ancestors. The great building belched a great torrent of embers for over an hour, and for some time the roofs of the nearby cottages were patrolled by their owners, not desiring the fate of Abe Perkins, but in the driving rain there was little chance of a smoldering ember starting a nearby roof fire. The papers reported that much of the furnishings were saved, but their condition seemed doubtful after being whipped by the driving rainstorm. As it was the third fire for Mr. Foss, following so closely the destruction of his brother's boarding house, arson was suspected, but circumstances don't support the conclusion. Supposedly, the house was well booked, with the first guests due to arrive in 5 days, and the age of the building is discounted by the fact that its nearby twin continued to prosper for many years. Since it was commonly agreed that Mr. Foss occupied the best site on the New Hampshire coast, many eagerly awaited a 4th Prospect House, but the building had been insured for only $9,000, and Mr. Foss realized that Rye's golden era was long past. A new building was soon built, which continued to cater to local outings, but the third fire had not failed to put Daniel Morrison Foss out of business. The new building took no overnight boarders, and Rye was less at least 26 accommodations, one for each letter of the alphabet. It's a picture here of John Hunt's Pleasant View. However unfortunate the fires of D.M. Foss, there was apparently little sympathy for his brother, John Hunt, whose fire ranks supreme in the annals of Rye's suspected arson. It is not recorded who discovered the Pleasant View to be on fire, and it appears that it was planned so as not to be discovered until too late. All the neighboring farmers were in the salt marshes that April morning. John Hunt was halfway to Portsmouth, and his wife was walking aimlessly on the beach when the Pleasant View, with doors and windows wide open, started belching flame. As with most of the early hotel fires, about all that could be done was try and save some of the furnishings. However, it was this action of removing the furniture that threw the most suspicion on John Hunt. For although the carpets showed every indication of having been previously nailed down, on the morning of the blaze, these carpet tacks had conveniently been removed. The attitude of the neighboring farmers is well illustrated by the fact that although the adjoining barn was full of hay, still in wagons, which could have been conveniently rolled out into the yard, Sandy Beach decided that John Hunt's hay wasn't worth saving. Perhaps they were too busy saving other property, for at the height of the blaze, the barn and boarding house of Sylvanus Foss were in very grave danger. but by covering the roofs of these buildings with wet carpets, that boarding house was spared to die of old age. In a small way, the loss of the Pleasant View served as a reminder of an earlier Rye fire, for in the excitement, the dog of George Pierce, formerly of the Sagamore House, went into the smoke-filled barn and failed to return. Thus was the rise and fall of the bedrooms of Rye. It had been a gay summer era when guests marched the boardwalks and buggies lined the beaches. If hotels have manners, the hotels of Rye were very well bred, for to the turn of the century they never burned a paying guest out of his bed. Indeed, burning as they all did during broad daylight, they never caused a native to lose a good night's sleep. But to the resort world, they did the unpardonable by burning out of season. And although not created for local consumption, had only the natives to mourn their passing. However, in another sense, the Rye Beach of the 1890s was far from dead, for although the hotel era was gone, it had been replaced by the era of private cottages. Desk clerks were moving out, and plumbing was moving in. So that is the end of this chapter on boardwalks and buggies. And next week, somebody else will be reading As Schooners Broke Upon Our Shores. So we'll get to hear about some of the shipwrecks. Thank you all for joining me. I look forward to History Happy Hour, whether I'm reading or not. So if you want to know more about what we're up to, we've been trying to put as much online as possible. So if you go to our website, you can catch all the other chapters that we've read. You can also catch all the chapters of The History of Rye by L.B. Parsons. And we did a cemetery tour, and there's a little tour of what's in the museum right now. And if you're interested in going to the museum, we're not open, we don't have open hours, but if you would like to go in, you can make an appointment, and we're happy to meet you there. Anyway, have a wonderful evening, and I hope you've enjoyed your little dose of history. Have a great week. Bye.